Welcome all. This is All Minus One Story Time with Bill. Today, we will continue our story of The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab. So guys, starting here in Chapter 1, I said I would get to this, and sure enough, we are. Chapter 1, Micro Reset. The first leg of our journey progresses across 5 macro categories that offer a comprehensive analytical framework to understand what's going on in today's world and how this might evolve. For ease of reading, we travel thematically through each separately. In reality, they are interdependent, which is where we begin. Our brains make us think in linear terms, but the world that surrounds us is nonlinear. That is to say, complex, adaptive, fast-paced, and ambiguous. So 1.1, Conceptual Framework. 3, Defining Characteristics of Today's World. The macro reset will occur in the context of 3 prevailing secular forces that shape our world today: interdependence, velocity, and complexity. This trio exerts its force to a lesser or greater degree on us all, whoever and whenever we may be, or wherever we may be. So let's look at that. Interdependence. Well, yes, human beings are dependent upon each other. That's part of us being a social creature within a collective. The thing that we have to understand, though, is that we are independent creatures. One of the things that I talk about often is within the Marxist, neo-Marxist, postmodernist movements, people are only looked at within the collective. Your individuality is lost in the crowd. That is a state of slavery. Your individuality gives you your freedom. That is part of it. The other part of it is your dependence on other people and other people being dependent upon you. But there is a way to do that that is voluntary, that is based on mutual exchange, and there is a way to do that which is what the most of the current economic theorists believe, that is, again, a form of slavery. And that is, everyone puts in together and we pull from this big pot. Well, that means you don't own anything in the end. Recall that the World Economic Forum put out a statement that you will own nothing and be happy. You'll like it. You're going to love owning nothing. Well, folks, I hate to tell you, but a state of slavery is a state where you own nothing. And then, of course, we have the idea of debt slavery, which is that we owe these folks because we have this fiat currency that isn't based on anything but numbers that they make up. However, they have the guns, they have the control, and therefore they will put you in jail, enslave you, imprison you, whatever else, garnish your wages, steal from you like they did Ian Smith of IntelliStim, where they took his legal fees, the money he had for legal fees, I think $173,000, $174,000 they just took. All the while, other gyms are open. All the while, the lockdown restrictions he violated was a while ago, but they're still going after him. So velocity, well, what do you mean? What kind of velocity? Like, we got to be specific. I'm assuming he's going to talk about it as the 1.1 here says interdependence. And complexity. Well, yes, complex systems exist in the world. The economy is one of those. It is why it is impossible to control from a centralized autocracy. You cannot centrally plan and control an economy. You can try. It's been tried. There's a great book you can find on Mises.org called 40 Centuries of Wage and Price Controls. I often recommend it. Maybe I'll do a story time on it sometime in the future. The complex nature of the market is individuals working together in chaos that basically brings about order. Now, these folks think the other way around. They think that the world is chaotic and therefore order must be imposed. And I don't think that that is the case. But let's keep going with the text. If just one word had to distill the essence of the 21st century, it would have to be interdependence. No, all human beings have always been interdependent. In fact, when he's talking about interdependency, I would guarantee you he's thinking of an anthropological mindset, the idea that we are tribal animals, that we are social animals, and that tribal life was socialistic in a way. People had to share. But that's because they didn't basically have alliances outside their tribe. Everyone else was a stranger, and therefore they had to rely on each other. Once you start relying on other groups outside of your group, that is free exchange and free trade. What they are trying to do is scale it up to the point where essentially everyone is connected to everyone, everyone is interrelated to everyone. And that is, I think, covered more in Schwab's Fourth Industrial Revolution, which I'll cover here in the future for certain. But we've always had interdependence, folks. It's what makes the world go round, really. It's what brought about civilization. The problem with civilization is as old as the biblical narratives go, that tyrants and kings, oligarchs, and whatever else try to organize the folk and then rain tyranny upon them. They exercise control, wage and price controls. They exercise things like picking winners and losers within the market, not allowing the market to take its natural place for some businesses to fail, and others by protecting some businesses that they like while allowing those others to fail. So let's keep going. A byproduct of globalization and technological process, it can essentially be defined as a dynamic of reciprocal dependence among the elements that compose a system. Okay, well, yeah, that's everything I just said, right? The fact that globalization and technological progress have advanced so much over the past few decades has prompted some pundits to declare that the world is now hyper-connected to some degree, but this is only because we outsource so much. We obfuscate our personal responsibility. Our societies obfuscate its manufacturing and responsibility to other nations. If we had better infrastructure, if we focused locally, then we would have the excess of money to reach out into the world and help those other parts of the world that need to be brought up financially much more easily. And we know this too with folks that are essentially conservative leaning or libertarian, that they tend to provide more charity, whereas people who are on the left end of the spectrum want the government to do everything for you. They're basically children who want a mommy and daddy into adulthood. A variant of interdependence on steroids. What does the interdependence mean in practice? Simply that the world is concatenated, linked together in the early 2010s. Kishore, however you say his name, the academic from former diplomat of Singapore, captured this reality with a boat metaphor. The 7 billion people who inhabit the planet Earth no longer live in more than 100 separate boats, countries. Well, that's not true. We live in, I think there's 200 some odd countries around the world. There's over 140 or so recognized by the UN. Instead, they all live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. Okay, I get his metaphor now. In his own words, this is one of the greatest transformations ever. No, it's actually the same thing. We've always all lived on the earth. The difference is that there are more of us, there's more technology, and travel and trade is much easier. But this, guys, is very old. We've always traded. We've always traveled. The reason why the American continents were populated before Europeans came over is because, well, there were Vikings that came over early on, although they supposedly never returned. And there were, of course, people who came across the Bering Strait, the Great Land Bridge. And we know this to some degree by tracing back genetics. We can also see obvious facial features of Native Americans, as we call them, the people that traveled over, and those who lived in the northern climates, such as Siberia, Mongolia, all that kind of stuff, in those portions of the Caucasus that transferred out this way. And we can really see it when you look at the Inuit or other northern tribes. They have very Asian features. In his own words, and this is one of the greatest transformations ever, in 2020, he pursued this metaphor further in the context of the pandemic by writing, "If we, 7.5 billion, are now stuck together on a virus-infected cruise ship, does it make sense to clean and scrub only 4 personal cabins while ignoring the corridors and airwells outside through which the virus travels?" The answer is clearly no. Yet this is what we have been doing. Since we are now in the same boat, humanity has to take care of the global boat as a whole. No, actually that's not true. Smallpox was inoculated back in ancient China. They used to blow smallpox scabs up your nose. In the West, we discovered how to defeat smallpox by basically taking cowpox, which is a strain that is similar but not very lethal, similar to chickenpox, and we inoculated people because it was similar enough by infecting them with the scabs of cowpox. How did we figure that out? Well, we figured that out individually as we were separated by trial and error, by experience, by observation. Women would contract cowpox from cows who were milking them, and they seemed to be immune to smallpox. Says, yet this is what we have been doing since we are now in the same boat. Humanity has taken care of the global boat as a whole. I don't think so. I think we would do a better job if we focused on our own areas instead of trying to tell everyone what to do. An interdependent world is a world of deep systematic connectivity in which all risks affect each other through the web of complex interactions. Always has been, always will be. That's those first, second, and third order consequences, and so forth. In such conditions, the assertion that the economic risk will be confined to the economic sphere or that the environmental risk won't have repercussions on risk of a different nature, economic, geopolitical, and so on, is no longer tenable. Well, again, authoritarians tend to think this way because they don't see that on a grassroots level that people can create their own solutions, that, people living in separate parts of the world can create their own solutions because some people don't. But if one person did, and they did that as an example, would you not follow and copy that example? Of course we would. This is how human history works. This is why we tell stories, in fact, is they are idealizations of the human condition. And we use those stories, those examples, to inform us. It's much like I was saying on my live show last night. Learn from my mistakes. This is how I teach my daughter, and will be teaching my future children. I'm going to be honest about my sins, about my mistakes, about what I've learned through hardship, and hopefully they will take that into account and not have to experience the same type of troubles, but also have them prepared for the world as to not be naive to how it works. Says we can all think of economic risks turning into political ones, like a sharp rise in unemployment leading to a pocket of social unrest. But why does that unemployment happen? Well, when you manipulate the markets through central banks, when you basically dictate who the winners and losers are, when you give bailouts, when you have all of this funny money system, you breed corruption, and therefore there is a huge amount of instability. If we had a commodity standard and the money was in the hands of the people instead of centralized, if it was decentralized, you would not see these issues. No, they would occur with natural disaster, of course. There, will always be famines and plagues. There will always be things that human beings have to face and risk. But this idea, again, from the authoritarians, is that they are so powerful that they can control all of these risks and mitigate them. And folks, it's just not going to happen. It's just not true. We see this in the writings of Mao. I've read before from them that he believed that they could basically bend nature to their very will. And this is a very old idea. But again, there's a Malthusian ideology behind a lot of this, and they think that there are just too many people And we have to do things to curb that as well. So again, it's all top down, it's all centralized, it's all authoritarian. Technological risk mutating into social ones, such as the issue of tracking the pandemic on mobile phones, provoking a societal backlash. Yeah, why? Because I value my privacy. And by the way, I already do this through your social media apps, folks. When considered in isolation, individual risk, whether economic, geopolitical, societal, or environmental in character, give the false impression that they can be contained or mitigated in real life. Systemic connectivity shows this to be an artificial construct. Well, isn't that what I just said? I'm glad Klaus Schwab agrees with me on this. Why is he then trying to have some sort of centralized top-down planning with all the world leaders? I mean, they're currently in Davos right now talking about all this stuff. Has Xi Jinping on there? Social credit score guy himself. In an interdependent world, risk amplifies each other and, in so doing, have cascading effects. That is why isolation or containment cannot rhyme with interdependence and interconnectedness. Well, if you, in the first part of this book, in the introduction, if you would have appreciated what sovereignty does, you wouldn't think this way. Remember, Trump was a xenophobe for trying to isolate America when the pandemic started. And you had to go out and hug a Chinese person in Chinatown, right? According to the lefties. And now President Biden is, restricting travel from other nations. It's all games, folks. It's all games about, what can I call you? What can I do to make people not trust you? What can I say? And so many people have come out, by the way, being like, why did we vote for Biden? Well, because you're dumb and you shouldn't be voting because you don't understand what goes on. Like, I highly believe this. I'm not saying that you can't vote. I'm saying that people who don't know what goes on shouldn't be voting. I love the feminists try to be like, well, men had the right to vote forever. Like 50 years. Literally, like 50 years before women did. Not a very long time. We're talking a generation and a half, 2 generations max. Most men never had a right to vote. The world has always been run by oligarchs, folks. It's always been run by a few. And every time we try to decentralize that power, the power eventually rises regardless because people begin to trust and rely on the government for things that they should be doing for themselves. And here now we have a power that's trying to rise and run the entire globe. The chart below, extracted from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report 2020, makes this plain. It illustrates the interconnected nature of the risk we collectively face. Each individual risk always conflates with those from its own micro category, but also with the individual risk from other macro categories. Economic risk appear in blue, geopolitical orange, societal in red, environmental in green, and technological in purple. In this manner, each individual risk harbors the potential to create ricochet effects by provoking other risk. As the chart makes clear, an infectious disease risk is bound to have a direct effect on global governance failure, social instability, unemployment, fiscal crisis, and involuntary mitigation, just to name a few. No, and no. If there was national sovereignty, this wouldn't be a problem. If the Chinese government had been honest and the WHO had been honest, this wouldn't be a problem. The social instability was caused by mostly fear and panic from the media, people at big tech censoring those who were saying calm down, that this isn't that big of a deal. Many medical professionals, in fact, don't agree. That's why the Great Barrington Declaration is out there. Hopefully I don't get yeeted for mentioning that, considering my video got taken down the other day for saying really nothing against anything that any medical professional has ever said. It just wasn't exactly what the WHO said, because again, this is about authoritarianism, folks. Financial crisis, well, again, all that was caused mainly by the governments. Many governments didn't lock down, remember? Florida opened back up and they've been doing quite well. North and South Dakota, I think they didn't lock down at all, but South Dakota was a big one that was like, oh, blah, blah, blah. Sweden's economy has been doing quite fine. I'm not sure how Japan's doing at the moment, but I do know that there are more suicides currently now than there are deaths from the coup. North Korea did not really, or sorry, not North Korea. South Korea did not really lock down either. Speaking of North Korea, though, and South Korea, look at North Korea, which is rather autonomous, although it has ties to the Chinese Communist Party. What's going on there with the coup? What's going on in Russia with it? There's a lot of nations, guys, that, yeah, they take certain procedures, but they're kind of doing their own thing, and no one's pointing to it. And we know from study after study that the lockdowns don't really do anything to mitigate anything. And the lockdowns are what are causing this fiscal crisis. On top of that, the WHO says you shouldn't be locking down. They advise not to do so. That it's just not good. It's going to cause those second, third order consequences. One of them largely is going to be as Western economies come to a halt, there will be mass starvation in third world nations. Each of these, in turn, will influence other individual risk, meaning that the individual risk from which the chain of effects started, in this particular case, infectious diseases, ends up amplifying many other risks, not only in its own macro category, societal risk, but also in the other four micro categories. Another interesting thing, of course, is Schwab had Xi Jinping there, and Xi Jinping were advising folks to basically get PPE, ship it back to China. They weren't allowing hospital beds that they owned in Australia to be used unless exorbitant fees were paid. And yet this guy is aligning with him. And then in his address to the World Economic Forum, Xi Jinping basically admitted nothing about how it was their fault for allowing this out, and they spread disinformation. Of course, maybe they're in cahoots. Maybe they wanted this to happen because the economy of China has been running just fine. And you can make a case for the authoritarianism there because they did lock down by putting people in their homes and basically welling them in. And if they died, they died. They did a lot of crazy stuff. Well, we have to recall that Wuhan, I can't recall off the top of my head, but it's like got 11 million people in it or 20 million or something crazy. They didn't really start telling the world about this until January of last year. But we have reports that they knew this was happening as early as October. It's a big financial hub. People travel in and out of there globally all the time. So maybe we could have stopped travel sooner. Maybe they could have been more responsible. And that didn't happen, of course. So again, I don't understand this authoritarian top-down kind of look at things because the one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world did nothing to help the rest of the world, and at the same time, they were invited to this World Economic Forum to basically opine on how wonderful they are and how the world needs a great reset, and you all need to have a Chinese communist / capitalist, basically fascistic system of government while they harvest organs from Uyghurs and other nasty things that they do. This displays the phenomenon of contagion by systematic connectivity. In the following sub-chapters, we explore the pandemic risk might entail from an economic, societal, geopolitical, and environmental technological perspective. And here is the chart. So they like these kind of charts. You might not be able to see this super well, but it is a bunch of dots that cross the line, and it shows, here we have natural disasters, extreme weather, human-made environmental disaster, biodiversity loss, food crisis. A lot of this, folks, is poor logistics. And it's poor logistics because you have people who are controlling things from the top down. See, good leaders, I'm not saying we don't need leaders, but good leaders allow there to be dissension and take advice from the people lower down on the totem pole from them, because they understand that those are the people that have the needs and have the perspective. Now, there might be somebody on the bottom who's just a complete idiot and has idiotic things to say. But there has never been a good leader who's totalitarian. I know there are voices out there in the creator sphere, the YouTubes or whatever other platforms you might be on, who seem to think otherwise. I think Charlemagne was talking about this not too long ago. I haven't watched much of his content lately, but in any case, and I completely disagree. I think that he's missing a lot of factors there, and he's a pretty bright guy. He's a pretty smart guy. But I just don't agree with that top-down authoritarian strongman thing. Now, do you need to be strong? Yes. But strength, as they say, comes from diversity, and the true strength from diversity is decentralizing. That is, diversifying yourself, not being a singular thing. You know what a singular entity becomes when it has only one task or one job? A slave, essentially. You should all strive to be polymaths. That is the Renaissance man. You should be multi-talented, a jack of all trades, master of none, right? An expert in few. And that's kind of how I see the world and how I approach life. And I've talked about this before. I went through an identity crisis at some point because I was going through this horrible relationship. It was very abusive, very mentally abusive, and whatever else. And I had broken my identity down into a singular point, and that was being dad. And once that was stripped away from me, it was a very hard thing to recover from. And it took me down a very dark path for a long time. This is just a thing. If you want to have a robust economy, it has to be diverse, right? If you want to be a robust individual, you have to be diverse, because if one thing is destroyed, and that's all that you are, you're destroyed. You have to be able to let one thing die and another thing come up. And I don't think having a top-down authoritarian style global government, global economy is the solution. In fact, if you go over to the Davos 2021 YouTube page, you can see the comments, and people were sitting there going, you created these problems, and now you want to fix them, and you want us to trust you. No, that's not how it works. So that was the survey. And last paragraph here. Interdependence has an important conceptual effect. It invalidates silo thinking, since conflation and systematic connectivity are what ultimately matters. Addressing a problem or assessing an issue or a risk in isolation from the others is senseless and futile. Yes and no. See, I kind of like the way he's thinking here in this problem solving, but you cannot say what happens in California to Joe Schmo is going to affect me all the way here. See, interconnectivity only goes so far, and that is those who are in my sphere, who I get to connect with directly. Now, making content like this, I get to connect with a lot of you, and I do try and engage with my audience, though small it may be. It's a thing where these folks, like Klaus Schwab, have no clue what my day-to-day life is. He's a billionaire as far as I know. He's at least a multi-millionaire. These folks are the elite of the elite, the richest of the richest, the most influential of influential. They don't have a freaking clue what it's like to live your life. Now, maybe they did some time ago, but few of them remain humble about it, right? They start to think, well, obviously I got here. Obviously I did well, so I must know better. And look, man, maybe they did run some good businesses and whatever else, but I doubt they did it with a stance of authoritarianism. It just doesn't work. Go check out Carlin Borisenko's stuff, because that's actually her doctorate is talking about psychology of workspaces and different types of leadership styles and how people work together and whatever else. Like these are things that are known. And most things, since we're always dealing with people, can be applied to the macro and the micro, which again, Schwab seems to outline here in his book. But we have to understand that, my friends, is it's one of those things where we have to understand that, yeah, not everything that I do here in my home, like cooking dinner or breakfast or making my bed, affects my neighbor next door. You might say, well, Bill, but that's not the case. He's talking about diseases spreading around the world. Right. And if we weren't so interconnected and we didn't depend on each other so much, we had more national autonomy, more sovereignty, and on an individualistic level, we would have been better protected. I believe that Schwab's argument is actually the opposite of this. It says, in the past, this silo thinking partially explains why so many economists failed to predict the credit crisis in 2008. No, they failed to predict it because they were following Keynesian economic models. And you had two people out there, Peter Schiff, an Austrian economist, and Ron Paul, also a student of Austrian economics, as I am as well. Two people were saying, no, this isn't going to work. It's going to fail. Who was right? Did Klaus Schwab predict it? No. Folks knew what was going on. They knew that they were getting rich quick, and they didn't care what happened to the little guy. That's why right now there's a big deal with this whole GameStop hedge fund nonsense. People are trying to rebel in any way and shape that they can because they're sick and tired of being disenfranchised. And why so few political scientists saw the Arab Spring coming in 2011? Again, I disagree. Leftists failed to see it. Folks like myself knew exactly what was going on. Just like I keep saying, there will be a hot civil war in this nation in about 8 years. I'm thinking 2030-ish, but, it's going to be like 2 administrations. Today, the problem is the same with the pandemic. Epidemiologists, public health specialists, economists, social scientists, and all the other scientists and specialists who are in the business of helping decision makers understand what lies ahead find it difficult and sometimes impossible to cross the boundaries of their own discipline. This is gaslighting to the 1,000th degree. Like, how many lights are there, folks? How many lights? Is it 2 lights or is it 3 lights? There have been epidemiologists saying we shouldn't handle things this way. But it is the centralized authoritarian WHO and the CDC here in the United States and the World Economic Forum, even though they're all NGOs. They're not, CDC is technically a government body, but it doesn't have any real authority, just recommendations. The experts are getting it wrong. And you, Mr. Schwab, are now saying to trust you, the expert. I'm afraid not. Not going to happen. That is why addressing complex trade-offs, such as containing the progress of the pandemic versus reopening the economy, is so fiendishly difficult. No, it's not. The WHO has said specifically, keep things open. Keep it open, unless you absolutely must not. And the data bears the same. The longest lockdown that I'm aware of was in Argentina, where they had something like a 60% infection rate regardless. And it was quite draconian, quite authoritarian. And they didn't have an economy they could crush because it's highly socialized, like most nations. And again, it's what voices they decide to listen to. If we did a plan like Sweden or Japan or South Korea, we might not have seen these things. But in my belief, the Western nations did this on purpose because they're taking marching orders from the UN, guys like Klaus Schwab, whose Great Reset is just a respinning of, Agenda 2030. And I read an article the other day about that. and I'll be reading more probably tomorrow about that. I want to get it done before I get out of town here for a week or so. Understandably, most experts end up being segregated into increasingly narrow fields. See, that is a bad thing. I would agree with that. Therefore, they lack the enlarged view necessary to connect the many different dots that provide the more complete picture and decision makers desperately need. And again, this is the thing about, like I said before, you have to diversify yourself. You need to be a polymath. I don't expect everyone to be a genius. I don't expect everyone to know everything or whatever, but you need to find folks that you trust who can distill these things down to you. Hopefully, I'm one of those folks that you believe you can trust because, folks, I will not lie to you. I'm just compelled to speak the truth, even if it has grave consequences on my very being. But anyways, before we get into the next part of velocity, I'm going to get out of here. I'll probably come back to it not next week, but the week after, only because, again, I have to be out of town for family business. And while I'm down there, I'm taking the opportunity to do some pretty cool training, man stuff, leadership training, firearms training, jiu-jitsu, combative stuff. And, it ought to be a good time. It ought to be a good refresher, get my mind out of here. We also help my wife's grandfather out and some other things. I also have some family down there I'll probably end up visiting. So I hope you all will miss me a little bit and will appreciate when I come back. So, because I did take a break at the end of December for about a week or so. And that's not necessarily the best thing if you're trying to grow your channel, but hey, I'm going to do it because what I'm doing is important. So guys, this has been Story Time. This has been The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab. My name is Bill, and you all be well.